Bodies were not found, only dozens of pairs of children's shoes, arranged in a grim ritualistic order on the bare concrete. But before the police tape, before the flashing lights, and before the silence of the forest was broken by sirens, there was only the sound of Masoness breathing and the relentless drumming of rain against the roof of the decommissioned church. Mason stood alone in the sanctuary. The air in the building was heavy, a suffocating mixture of wet rot, old timber, and something sweeter, like dried flowers that had turned to dust decades ago. He was a man of practicalities, a contractor who measured his life in square footage and billable hours. He did not believe in ghosts. He believed in structural integrity, load-bearing walls, and the corrosive nature of water. But staring at the wall behind the altar, Mason felt a prickling at the base of his neck that had nothing to do with the damp draft. He had been hired to strip the interior. It was a simple job: remove the pews, tear down the water-damaged paneling, and prepare the shell for a community center conversion. He had been working for 6 hours straight. The generator hummed outside, powering the halogen work light that cast long, stark shadows against the peeling white paint. He had reached the altar. The wall behind the simple wooden cross looked identical to the rest of the sanctuary. But when Mason had swung his hammer to test the studs, the sound was wrong. Thump, thump, boom. It was a hollow, resonant sound. A deep bass note that suggested a void much larger than the standard 16-inch spacing between studs. Mason lowered his hammer. He wiped sweat from his forehead with the back of a gloved hand. He looked at his watch. It was past 7:00 p.m. The reasonable choice was to pack up. The light was failing outside, the rain was picking up, and he was exhausted. He could come back tomorrow with the blueprints and a sledgehammer. He could leave this dark, cold anomaly for the morning sun. Every instinct in his gut told him to walk away, to lock the heavy oak doors and drive back to the motel in town. The sensation was irrational, a childish fear of the dark, and that irritated him. He was a professional. He needed to know if the void was a structural hazard before he finalized the demolition plan for the next day. Just check the framing, he muttered to himself, his voice sounding flat and dead in the empty hall. He gripped his crowbar. The steel felt cold even through his leather gloves. He jammed the curved end behind the edge of the wood paneling directly behind the altar. He expected resistance. He expected the groan of rusted nails fighting against the wood. Instead, the panel popped loose with terrifying ease, as if it had been designed to be removed. Mason pulled. The wood shrieked briefly, then gave way. A draft of air hit his face. It was not the wet, moldy air of the main sanctuary. It was dry, stale, and motionless. It smelled of preserved time. He widened the gap, ripping away 2 more boards until he had an opening large enough to step through. He unclipped the heavy flashlight from his belt and clicked it on. The beam cut through the swirling dust motes. He stepped through the false wall. The space beyond was a windowless room, perhaps 12 feet square, encased in rough concrete that had never been painted. Mason swept the light across the floor. He stopped. His breath hitched in his throat, and for a long moment, his brain refused to process the visual data. It was not empty. Mason stood paralyzed in the threshold of the hidden room. The silence here was different. It was heavy, pressing against his eardrums like deep water. The floor was gray concrete, smooth and clean, contrasting sharply with the debris-littered sanctuary he had just left. Arranged on this floor were shoes, dozens of them. They were not thrown in a pile. They were not scattered. They were arranged with a geometric precision that made Mason's stomach turn over. There were 3 perfect concentric circles. The outer circle was formed of larger shoes, sneakers, leather boots, galoshes, sizes that would fit a 10 or 12-year-old. The middle circle was smaller. The inner circle was tiny, composed of toddler shoes, soft-soled booties, and miniature patent leather dress shoes. Every single pair was aligned perfectly. The toes pointed inward, toward the empty center of the bullseye. Mason forced himself to breathe. He stepped closer, the beam of his flashlight shaking slightly. The dust on the shoes was thick, a gray blanket that unified them, suggesting they had sat here, undisturbed, for a very long time. He crouched down near the outer circle. He did not want to touch them. The energy in the room was repellent, a static charge of misery. He leaned in close to a pair of red canvas sneakers, the rubber soles yellowed with age. Inside the heel, written in faded black ink on the lining, was a name. Miller. Mason moved the light to the next pair. A brown leather loafer. David S. He moved to the inner circle. A tiny white shoe with a buckle. Baby Jane. He stood up so fast his head swam. This was a collection. A trophy room. The realization hit him with the force of a physical blow. Someone had built this room. Someone had sealed it. Someone had spent hours, perhaps days, arranging these items in this specific maddening pattern. Jesus, Mason whispered. He backed away, intending to leave to call the police immediately. But as he turned, his flashlight beam swept across the far corner of the room. The uniformity of the concrete floor was broken there. He froze. In the corner, the concrete was slightly different in color. Darker, rougher. It looked like a patch job. A rectangular section, roughly 6 feet long and 3 feet wide, that had been poured later than the rest of the floor. Mason looked at the shoes. Then he looked at the patch. The logic was inescapable. The horror of it was mathematical. The shoes were the markers. The patch was the grave. He should not touch it. He knew that. This was a crime scene. But the compulsion to know, the desperate need to verify the nightmare before he brought the world into this room, overwhelmed him. He needed to be sure. He walked to the corner. He knelt on the cold floor. He took his crowbar and tapped the edge of the patch. Sounded dull. Loose. He wedged the tip of the bar into the seam where the rough concrete met the smooth floor. He pushed. The slab shifted. It was not poured as part of the foundation. It was a heavy, pre-cast slab set on top of dirt. Mason gritted his teeth and heaved. The concrete slab, weighing perhaps 80 pounds, slid aside with a grinding rasp that echoed like a scream in the small room. He pointed the flashlight into the hole. He expected white bone. He expected the grin of a skull. He braced himself for the smell of decay. Instead, he saw red fabric. It was a shirt. A small, faded red t-shirt, folded neatly. Beside it, a pair of blue jeans. A yellow dress. Mason reached down, his hand trembling uncontrollably, and touched the red shirt. It was stiff with dirt, but beneath it was nothing. Just earth. He dug his fingers into the soil, frantic now, tearing at the dirt, expecting to find the remains beneath the clothes. He dug until his fingernails broke. He dug until he hit the hard-packed clay of the earth. There were no bones. There was no skin. There was only the clothing. The shoes were on the floor. The clothes were in the grave. The children were nowhere. The flashing lights of the Royal Canadian Mounted Police cruisers painted the interior of the church in rhythmic strokes of blue and red. The silence was gone, replaced by the crackle of radios, the heavy tread of boots, and the low murmurs of investigators. Mason sat on the steps of the altar, a blanket draped over his shoulders, watching the forensic team work. He felt hollowed out, as if the void from the wall had transferred itself inside his chest. The lead investigator, a tall woman named Detective Sergeant Harrow, approached him. She looked tired, her face drawn in the harsh work lights they had set up. "We've cleared the patch," she said quietly. Her voice was devoid of the professional detachment Mason expected. She sounded disturbed. "And we've catalogued the shoes. Did you find them?" Mason asked. He did not need to specify who. Harrow shook her head. "No bodies, Mason. Not under the patch. Not behind the other walls. We have the radar team scanning the grounds now, but..." She trailed off, looking back at the dark opening in the wall. "Who was it?" Mason asked. "We ran the names from the shoes," Harrow said, sitting down on the step next to him. "They match missing persons files from 1968 to 1974. 7 children vanished from the district. The cases went cold 40 years ago." She opened a folder she was holding. The church records show the minister at the time was a Reverend Thomas Ashford. He oversaw the construction of the altar extension in 1967. "Get him," Mason said. His hands curled into fists under the blanket. "You have the evidence. You have his trophies." Harrow closed the folder. She looked at Mason with eyes that had seen too much of the world as cruelty. "We see not get him, Mason." Mason stared at her. "Why? Did he run?" "He died," Harrow said softly. Thomas Ashford died in a nursing home in Winnipeg in 1999. He was 84 years old. The nurses said he was a gentle soul. He used to read to the other patients. He died in his sleep. The words hung in the air, heavy and poisonous. Mason felt a surge of nausea. He got away with it. He lived a full life, Harrow continued, her voice tight. He retired. He collected his pension. He probably bounced his grandchildren on his knee. And all that time he knew exactly where these shoes were. He knew exactly what he had done. "But the bodies," Mason insisted, desperation creeping into his voice. "If we find the bodies, we can at least give them back to the families. We can prove what he did." "We re-looking," Harrow said. "But Mason, the clothes under the slab? They were folded, laundered. There was no blood, no DNA that we can find yet." Suddenly, the forensic anthropologist emerged from the hidden room. He was holding a small, plastic-bagged item. He walked over to Harrow and Mason. "Detective," the man said, "we found something else under the layer of dirt where the clothes were, at the very bottom of the pit." Harrow took the bag. Mason leaned in. It was a photograph. It was black and white, slightly curled from the damp, but preserved in a glass jar that had been buried with the clothes. It showed the interior of the church. The pews were full of children. In the center stood Reverend Ashford, a tall, smiling man with a kind face. He was looking directly at the camera. But it was the background that froze Mason's blood. In the photo, behind the smiling Reverend, the wall behind the altar was under construction. The framing was visible, and standing in the gaps between the studs, barely visible in the shadows of the construction, were the children. They were not tied up. They were not crying. They were standing still, looking at the Reverend with absolute trusting adoration. "He did not just take them," Mason whispered, the realization dawning on him with horrific clarity. "He made them walk in there." The investigation lasted 3 weeks. They tore the church apart. They dug up every square inch of the surrounding 3 acres. Ground-penetrating radar scanned the foundation until the data was a blur of noise. They found nothing. No bones. No teeth. No physical trace of the 7 children other than the clothes and shoes they had been wearing when they disappeared. The consensus among the profilers was that Ashford had not buried them on consecrated ground. He had disposed of them somewhere else, somewhere deep in the woods or the ocean. The room behind the altar was not a grave. It was a shrine. A private gallery where he could revisit his possessions. Mason packed the last of his tools into his truck. The rain had finally stopped, replaced by a gray, indifferent overcast sky. The police tape was still fluttering in the wind, but the urgency was gone. The media vans had left a day ago, disappointed by the lack of gore. He looked back at the church. It was just a building again, wood, stone, glass. But for Mason, it had become a monument to a specific, unbearable truth. He had spent his life fixing things. If a roof leaked, he patched it. If a foundation cracked, he reinforced it. He believed that if you worked hard enough, you could repair the damage. But this was damage that could not be repaired. He realized now why the clothes were folded, why the shoes were in circles. It was an act of ownership. Ashford had not just killed those children. He had consumed their identities. By keeping their shoes and clothes, he had kept them. And by dying peacefully in his sleep, he had robbed the world of retribution. There would be no trial, no verdict, no justice. The parents of those children had mostly died of old age, never knowing. The evil had won, simply by outlasting the clock. Mason started the engine of his truck. He looked down at his hands. They were strong, capable hands, but they felt useless now. He knew he would never renovate another building. He could not look at a wall without wondering what was behind it. He could not look at a floor without wondering what lay beneath. He put the truck in gear and drove away from the church, leaving the town behind. As he drove, a single image played on a loop in his mind, more haunting than any corpse could have been. It was not the darkness of the room. It was not the smell of the rot. It was the shoes, the way the toes pointed toward the center. He realized the center of the circle was not empty. In Ashford's mind, he had been standing in the center. The shoes were arranged to look at him. Even in death, the children were forced to attend his service, trapped in a silent, eternal congregation under the floorboards of a holy house. The road ahead was long and gray. Mason turned on the radio to drown out the silence, but he kept the volume low. He did not want to miss the sound of the road, or the engine, or the world still turning, indifferent and vast, hiding its millions of secrets just beneath the surface.